Sessions in PHP. Prevent session fixation attacks. A session fixation attack is when an attacker exploits vulnerabilities on a website to gain access to a user's account. They do this by getting the user to use a session that the attacker has access to. There are several ways they could do this, for example using a shared computer in a library for instance, or by getting the user to run code that sets their session cookie. Let's look at how the latter might work. First, the attacker visits the site and obtains a legitimate session ID. Then they get the victim to use that session ID. They could do this if the site is vulnerable to a cross-site scripting attack, for example. This happens when displaying user-supplied data without properly escaping it first by using code like this. The attacker could insert some client-side JavaScript code like this into a page on the site. When the victim visited the site, this code would be executed, creating the cookie with the value supplied by the attacker. Instead of creating a new session for the victim, the web server would see that a valid session already existed and simply resume the session. The victim now has the same session ID as the attacker. The victim then logs in and accesses a page in their account that is only available if they're logged in. As the attacker is using the same session as the victim, they also have access to anything the user has access to. So how can we protect against this type of attack? Well, first you can make sure you avoid cross-site scripting vulnerabilities by escaping any user-supplied data when you display it, by using the HTML special chars function, for example. You can also use the session regenerate ID function, which changes the session ID but maintains the session data. So the victim would log in, still using the compromised session, but when they authenticate correctly, the session ID is regenerated, meaning that the attacker no longer has access to the user's session. If you were really paranoid, you could regenerate the session ID on every single request. However, as the session data is written to disk on the server, this would be an unacceptable overhead. It's only necessary to do it when the user's authentication state changes, for example, when they log in like this. So on our login page, the session has already been started, and we can see the session ID in the cookie here. If we log in, the session ID remains the same. Here in our login controller, if the user authenticates properly, we're putting the user ID in the session. So the best place to regenerate the session ID is here, as soon as the user has authenticated successfully. We pass in true to delete the old session. Now if we look at the session ID before we log in, and then we log in, we can see that the session ID has changed, but the session data has been maintained as the user ID is still in the session.